curator at the Missoula Art Museum. Thanks so much for coming tonight. We had a little technical difficulty. What's a lecture without technical difficulty, right? So we thought we'd get that out of the way as soon as we started. This lecture is held on the occasion of a special exhibition for the Missoula Art Museum called Nexus, the Leela and Rudy Audio Family Collection. That exhibition is on view through June 24th in our Carnegie Gallery. And it's because of that exhibition that we're actually here tonight. It's a good problem to have when you have so much art in the museum that you can't have lectures there. So we took the lecture and came over here to Hellgate Auditorium. So thanks for sticking with us and finding this spot over here. We're really pleased to welcome one of the finest critical minds in contemporary craft, Glenn Adamson. Leela and Rudy were really wonderful supporters of contemporary artists, as evidenced by the exhibition, and they're wonderful supporters of MAM. And we're really grateful to the audio family, Arnie, who's not here, Lisa, Lar, and Chris, for loaning these pieces that make up the collection, and also for allowing MAM to offer this first ever view of the collection. It's really quite breathtaking. For those of you who have seen the exhibition, you can remember the breadth of that collection and how full the gallery is. And it's really the Leela and Rudy's kids who inherited the Herculean task of carrying on their parents' legacy, which they've done really admirably. They've devoted hundreds of hours to the task of photographing, cataloging, packing, and moving these artworks, and that are of Leela and Rudy, but also everybody else in the collection. And it was an amazing process to work with them to select works from that collection, using photographs largely that Chris took in trying to select pieces as things were being moved around and packed and unpacked and repacked and sliding every which way. So it was really a very rewarding experience to be able to look at those pieces and have things come together. Tonight, Glenn will talk about Peter Voulkos' radical departures from precedent in the medium of ceramics, reshaping the possibilities for what was the discipline of ceramics, which was really very focused on pots at that time. And he's going to help place his work in context of his immediate colleagues, such as Rudy Audio. So it's really nice that we have somebody who's such an expert drawing such definite parallels. He's the former director of New York's Museum of Arts and Design, where he co-curated the exhibition, Peter Voulkos, The Breakthrough Years. And if you don't have a copy of the catalog, we have them out front. You probably saw them as you came in. Those are available for sale, and Glenn would be very happy to sign copies of that, as well as Thinking Through Craft after the lecture. We're going to go for, 40, 45 minutes maybe, and open things up for Q&A afterwards like we usually do. So as you're looking at the slides and thinking about Peter Voulkos and Rudy Audio and that wonderful magical thing that happened here in Montana in the early 50s, prepare your questions and get ready to ask him the really hard questions, because that's what he's here for. Adamson has a really distinguished career as a scholar. He's currently the senior scholar at the Yale Center for British Art, and he's also editor-at-large for the magazine Antiques. His publications, I mentioned a few of them, but they also include Art in the Making, which just came out and was co-authored with Julia Bryan Wilson, The Invention of Craft from 2013, The Craft Reader from 2010. Do you have all these in your bookshelves?
Not yet.
Great. Not yet? Good. Well, here's your opportunity. And he's the founding co-editor of the Academic Journal of Modern Craft, which is really exciting. So can you please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Glenn Adamson to the podium? Thank you. I also wanted to point out that tonight we're being recorded by Missoula Community Access TV, and I'd like to thank them for recording that lecture as part of a media assistance grant. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Brandon. It's great to see you all here tonight, and so exciting to be gathered here to talk about one of my favorite subjects. I'll get to that in a second, but I just want to say, first of all, what an incredible pleasure it is for me to be here and to have met Brandon and Laura and the team at the Missoula Art Museum. So impressed with that institution and with the Audio Family Collection show. And also I just wanted to say a big thank you to Peter Held, who has been my sort of Virgilian figure guiding me through Montana, and the Archie Bray Foundation in particular, where I had a chance to visit for the first time this morning. And this is in fact my first time in Montana, so it's been a wonderful experience so far. I'm going to start with a personal story, which has to do with this piece. I was an intern at the Everson Museum in Syracuse, New York, when I was 21 years old. I just graduated from college. And I had gone there thinking that I was going to specialize in historic ceramics, so, old things from China, Europe, and so on. And when I actually got there, I realized that mostly what they had was 20th century American ceramics. And I had studied ancient Chinese ceramics a little bit and some other topics, but I'd never seen anything so recent in my art history courses. And so I asked the curator, whose name is Tom Pichet, to explain the field to me. Basically, I said to him, what should I be thinking about all of this stuff? It looks kind of crazy. And so he walked me over to this piece, which Voulkos made in 1956. And he said something along the lines of, this was made by somebody called Peter Voulkos. He's the first person you need to know about, and everything else depends on him. So he's the center of the story. And that lodged in my mind, and I went off and I read everything I could about Voulkos, chiefly the writings of Garth Clark and Rose Slivka, and found that actually not much had been written about him that recently. In fact, Slivka's work, which is really the definitive historical work on Voulkos that was done when he was alive, really culminated in a long monographic study that was published in 1978 alongside an exhibition that happened that same year. And actually not much has happened since in terms of new research on Voulkos and his work. So it always struck me that this was a little bit like if nobody had done any work on, let's say, Pablo Picasso's Cubist work. Because Voulkos is that important for ceramics, everybody seems to agree on that, but nobody could really say why, at least not in a lot of detail, and not with the kind of art historical rigorous analysis that one might expect for such a towering and important figure. Next slide, please, Brennan, thanks. So that led ultimately to this exhibition, this intention that I had of trying to look at what really made Voulkos important. I was very fortunate in finding two other people to work with. One was Andrew Perchuk, who's at the Getty Research Institute and is a specialist in Californian art, post-war Californian art. And he was my co-curator on the exhibition. And I also was able to work with an assistant curator at the Museum of Arts and Design, where I was director at the time that we were preparing the exhibition. And she is called Barbara Paris Gifford. And so I just want to acknowledge them as very important collaborators for this project. But what we decided to do, after thinking about the project and looking at the work in some detail, was to look at what we ultimately called the breakthrough years of his career, which run, in our view, from about 1952 or 1953 up to 1968. And I'll try to explain for you this evening why that chronology makes sense to us. But it's not incidental for our purposes tonight that that story begins here in Montana, and it also includes at least two very important moments that occurred at the Archie Bray Foundation that were decisive in setting his course forward. So you may be familiar, even here in Montana, I think you all are probably more familiar with Voulkos' work than most Americans are. But if you know his work, you might be particularly aware of his later pieces, the big wood-fired so-called stacks, which look like giant vase forms, or the big plates that you hang on the wall. That's certainly on the East Coast what people know, because the early work from the 50s and 60s just didn't come east very much. So what we wanted to do was acknowledge the importance of that later work, but really focus on this early, transformative, avant-garde moment in his career, and explain, again, what had happened and why and how. And so that's what I'm going to try to explain for you tonight in a sort of brief form, and look forward to talking to you about it afterwards. I'm also going to, as Brandon mentioned, I'm going to contextualize this a little bit, both in terms of another project that I'm working on at the moment, which is actually about British ceramics, just to show you how far Voulkos' influence traveled, and then I'll wrap up with a few words about, of course, Rudy Audio. So here's Voulkos early on. Any lecture or published statement or exhibition on Voulkos cannot fail to mention that he was extremely handsome. He was very charismatic, son of Greek immigrants, like Rudy Adio, in fact, a son of immigrants, raised in Bozeman, Montana, and had gone to fight in the Pacific Theater in the Second World War, and in fact had served as a nose gunner. And I always think, in reference to later controversies about his ceramics, when people started getting in his face about all the remarkably incoherent things that they said he was doing in ceramics and got aggressive with him, I always think that having been a nose gunner in the Pacific Theater, probably that didn't stress him out too much. So he clearly, at any rate, was a man of extreme personal presence and magnetism, and those of you who knew him, and I know there are a lot of you here tonight who did, will certainly remember that and attest to that. But also, and I'm not sure how much this came across in later years, but he was also an extraordinarily sensitive and intelligent and articulate person. So a real artist's artist in a lot of ways, and somebody who was like a sponge, who could pick up the ideas from a whole number of different artistic trajectories and put them into his work. So we go from that handsome, well-mannered young man to this bad boy, enfant terrible, kind of monster of 20th century ceramics. And of course here he's sort of mugging to the camera. Certainly a man with a great sense of humor as well. And what we're trying to do in the exhibition, which I sort of said, by the way, after opening at the Museum of Arts and Design, has now traveled to the Renwick Gallery. So if you happen to be in Washington, D.C., anytime this spring or summer, you can actually see it in person. But what we tried to do in the exhibition, and what I'm going to be trying to do for you in my remarks tonight, is explain this transformation from that first picture to this second picture. Next slide. So back to the beginning. Voulkos went on the GI Bill to study at what was then Montana State College in Bozeman, and learned to throw and make ceramics, and in fact dig clay out of the ground from Francis Senska, important teacher at the college. He had intended originally to study painting, and he remained very interested in painting, as you'll see. But he was sort of diverted into the pot shop, and he discovered that he had an incredible aptitude for this material. As he later said, when I get together with a ball of clay, it's perfect. I could probably make a pot from a pile of sand. So he felt very, very attuned to this material. And he rapidly developed a set of skills in it. He, for example, developed this technique of wax resist decoration, which involved painting on the surface of the pot in wax and then wiping a slip or other colorant over that. And as you can see, it means that the slip doesn't attach to the part where the wax is, because it repels that liquid. And so you get this wonderful kind of relief effect. And as you can also see from the tureen on the right, he was also a very skilled thrower, and in fact would become very popular as a demonstrator because of his skill at the wheel over the years. He, after his study at Bozeman, went over to the California College of the Arts and Crafts in the Bay Area, and he actually got his thesis with a concentration in lidded vessels like the one on the right. So he kind of was specializing in these tureens. And then he went on to become a very accomplished and successful professional studio potter, functional potter, spending time back here at the Archie Bray Foundation, also out in California, showing at exhibitions all over the country, often winning prizes for his work and also attracting press attention. And so he was actually making a very good living after he graduated with his MFA, not something that all graduating MFAs can say. And so you might have thought that he would have just stuck with this and become a leader of what was then a very successful and robust movement of studio pottery in the country. But instead, of course, he threw it all away and started to pursue his own imaginative course that was explicitly a response to several outside influences that, as I say, he would take up with great speed and energy and intelligence. So I'm just going to enumerate a few of those for you. The first one, and I think maybe the first one that he actually became aware of, although it's a little bit difficult to say, is Picasso and Matisse, particularly Picasso. This plate actually is maybe a little bit more like Matisse in terms of its technique, but it shows you the kind of pseudo-cubist, pseudo-abstract figural representation that he was interested in 1953, 54, 55. And it's made using another new technique that he invented, which he called slip stenciling, where he would cut out, literally with scissors out of a piece of thick paper, he would cut out the figures, lay them on the surface of the pot, and then again wipe the slip over the whole surface, then strip away the paper and be left with, again, this kind of relief effect. So he's doing something physically here that's with paper that's a little bit like what he was doing with the wax resist I mentioned earlier. But also notice the way that he uses the plate as essentially the canvas for an avant-garde image. He's squared off the throne plate, so literally sliced off its edges, a move that will become very common in the course of his work, this idea of altering a hand-thrown functional vessel. And of course, the idea of taking a functional pot and turning it into something that looks and feels like an artwork, which is something that he's thinking about specifically in relation to Picasso. And of course, as I'm sure you all know, Picasso was also making ceramics at this time, and Voulkos apparently had pictures of them pinned up on his studio wall. So I do think about this very much in relation to Picasso's work, but also one might think of it in relation to, let's say, Matisse's late paper cut works, which seem like a very direct influence on this kind of piece. From there, he becomes much more interested in three-dimensional experimentation, though. And something important happens, which is that he goes to Black Mountain College in 1953, and there meets not only this visiting group of Soetsu Yanagi, Bernard Leach, and Shoji Hamada, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, but also all of the avant-garde artists that are gathered there. And I'm sure most of you have heard of Black Mountain. It was really the most avant-garde educational experience one could have in 1940s and 50s America. So Robert Rauschenberg was there, Franz Klein was down there, although Voulkos didn't meet him until a little bit later in New York City. John Cage, the incredible conceptual composer, was there. Merce Cunningham, the choreographer, was there. Marguerite Wildenhain, a German-born Bauhaus-trained potter, was there, who became kind of like a nemesis or opposite number to Voulkos, was there. So a lot to react to. And by 1956, which is maybe the most important year in his chronological development, he's able to make works like this one, and this is one piece that I'm showing you in two different views. It's called Raschiato, and it, in some ways, refers to functional prototypes. So it has spouts, more than one, it has 4 of them, almost like a crown. It has handles, but as you can see, particularly I think on the left-hand slide, you can see how that curved C-shaped handle actually comes around and enters the body of the pot, so it actually pierces the side of the vessel. And then it also has straps and other forms of, what should we call them, ornament or attachments that are put on in this kind of crazy, incoherent, irrational way. So it's a kind of anti-pot, you could say, but what's crucial is that it's made entirely using the existing vocabulary of functional pottery. In other words, he's not doing anything to the clay that he wouldn't have done in terms of physical technique in his own functional work. He's still working with hand-thrown and slab elements. He's still using the same materials, so stoneware and slip. He's still even using, as I say, motifs like spouts and handles, but he's rearranging them in a way that's totally unconventional, obviously non-functional, and to many people, including Marguerite Wildenhain, completely appalling. In fact, when the magazine Craft Horizons published its first coverage of Voulkos in 1956, an article by Conrad Brown, Wildenhain wrote an angry letter into the magazine's editors and canceled her subscription. So this was, I mean, to us now, this looks like absolutely mainstream modernist sculpture, very much inspired by Cubism, also maybe looking at other contemporary sculptors like David Smith maybe is kind of in the frame here in a piece like this, again, Picasso. But for people in the studio pottery world, this just seemed bonkers. The piece that is undeniably the best known of this Annus Mirabile, this miracle year of Voulkos's breakthrough, 1956, is this one, Rocking Pot. And certainly on the East Coast, if there's one early Voulkos piece that people know, it's this one. The reason for that is essentially that it is because of where it lives now. It was acquired by the Renwick Gallery in the early 1980s, I think, directly from Voulkos' studio. And they immediately began using it as one of their icon pieces and showing it a lot. And so people on the East Coast became very aware of it. It's also, of course, very striking and strange. So it is called rocking pot because it actually is on rockers. So the idea is that you could actually make the pot lurch back and forth, which is a kind of reference to kinetic sculpture maybe. So another thing he could have been looking at, but also is a kind of joke, because one thing you can say about a well-made pot is that it should sit squarely on a flat surface and not rock. That's what you would want from your teacup, right? And so this thing is sort of, jumping all over the place. It has holes that are very roughly cut into it. It has these kind of saber-like forms made of clay that penetrate it, so it's been run through, literally. And it is, of course, again, a thrown vessel, but that vessel has been turned upside down to make the body of the clay object. So you couldn't come up with a better illustration of a kind of antagonism to the traditional aesthetics of studio pottery. Everything that pottery is supposed to be, this ain't. It's very violent as a gesture of attack against traditional pottery. Next slide. One of the really exciting things that we were able to do in the exhibition was to include objects that had not been seen for a long time. And one of the most exciting to come to light is this one, which was recently acquired by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And as you can see, it looks an awful lot like rocking pot, and it was made pretty much at the same time. We think it might have even been fired in the same kiln load. Certainly from the same clay, although it has a covering sort of sheath of iron dark slip. So it has a different coloration, and of course it lasts the rockers, but it's actually about twice the height of rocking pot, and it has this kind of stately quality. Those of you who are familiar with Haniwa figures, which are these ancient Japanese tomb figures that are some of the earliest ceramics that we have, in fact, might recognize a certain resonance between that and this object and Voulkos' other works of this period. And that's definitely something that was in Voulkos' mind. He was thinking a lot about Japanese ceramics already at this time, although he had not been to Japan. And one rather charming thing that he later said was that when he first saw Japanese tea bowls and other ceramics for the first time, he couldn't believe how small they were because he had only seen them in photographs. And so a lot of these kind of giant-sized, ambitious ceramics that he was doing in this year and later were sort of made under Japanese ceramics, but kind of getting the scale wrong, as it were. Next slide. So what else does he do that makes the traditional ceramics establishment get riled and expands his repertoire? Well, one important thing is that he starts to introduce color in a different way. So this piece is called Cross, and it dates from 1959, 1960. And it's another piece that has a very important history and has been very much associated with his breakthrough period. This one is owned by the Museum of Arts and Design, formerly the American Craft Museum. And it was included in an exhibition called Objects USA, which began in 1969. Do people know about Objects USA? Is this ringing a bell? It was the most important craft exhibition that happened in the post-war period in America. So it began, in fact, in Washington in 1969, and it traveled not only to New York, but also to no less than 20 American cities and 10 European cities in total. So 30 museums exhibited this show. It had over 300 objects in it and about 150 artists in it. And this piece, Cross, which I'm again showing you from both sides, was used as a kind of logo for the exhibition. So it was reproduced in one exhibition review after another, one newspaper, one magazine after another, all over the country. This was about 10 years after it was made. So the piece was made in 1959. The show was in 1969. But its reproduction sort of sealed its reputation as one of Voulkos' key objects. It's a little bit hard to say why he made this as a cross, because as far as we can tell, and maybe some of you can inform me about this, he doesn't seem to have had any real relationship with religion or Christianity, or indeed the Greek Orthodox Church, which is something I wondered when I first started thinking about this piece. It might have more to do with the technical aspect of it, because of course wet clay does not really want to stick out to the sides, as any of you who are potters can attest. And so there's a little bit of a kind of daring quality to the composition, where the piece is reaching out as if it had two arms. But at any rate, the thing that maybe is most striking about it is the color. So he's working, as always, in stoneware, high fire clay, but he's then, after firing it, he's applying lower fire enamel colors, very bright colors, almost like a hobbyist would use, to get these oranges and purples and greens, and then also combining that with typical high fire colors like cobalt blue. Next slide. So that gives you a sense of some of the innovations that he's undertaking round about 1956 and into the next couple of years. The other thing that he does, which is super, super important to the story, is that he moves into a studio with John Mason, another very important ceramic artist at the time. That studio, or maybe I should call it a facility because it's almost the scale of a factory, is located on Glendale Boulevard in Los Angeles. He's teaching at the Otis Art Institute at this time, so he has a lot of followers that have sort of attached themselves to him. Mason is not teaching there officially, but he's also very present at Otis, and so the two of them sort of join forces and they go off to this studio. And the reason that they build the facility is because they want to be able, as you can see, to work big, much bigger than anybody has worked before in the studio's ceramics tradition in America. So to be able to do this, they all not only get a hold of a whole lot of clay, but they also bring in a lot of equipment that they're going to need to work at. And they draw on the local resources of California industry to do this. So they bring in humidifiers from the fruit factory or fruit warehouses that are located around them in Los Angeles. And the humidifiers allow them to keep the clay wet for longer so they can work it longer. They bring in industrial scale dough mixers from a bakery in order to actually mix their clay. And then crucially, they make this huge walk-in kiln that will allow them to fire these very, very large pieces. And this is a wonderful series of photographs that was taken at the time that show you how Voulkos works with this clay at this scale. So Brandon, if you could just go next slide, and then the next one, and the next one, and then one more. That shows you how he's getting from a thrown huge cylinder, sort of giant-sized version of what he would have done as a functional potter, to pieces like this. And this is a shot of him in 1959 in that Glendale Boulevard studio. And one thing that you'll have noticed as those slides went by is that most of the pieces that he's using are themselves also thrown elements. So he'll take a big conical shape, for example, that he's thrown on the wheel, and stick it to the side of the piece, and then work it in, cut into it, reshape it, paddle it, which again is something that he did already in his functional pottery days, but now is using to very different effect. And as you can see, he's able to create this extraordinary set of monumental forms with a very muscular, abstract, almost seismic or topological quality. And he would talk about these pieces often as being very influenced by the Montana landscape. So the geology of this part of the world was very important to him, and some of them even had names that specifically referred to Montana geological features, like Black Butte Divide, for example, would be a good example of that. So he's basically worked himself to the position now of being, without doubt, the most impressive and astonishing figure probably in the whole history of ceramics in terms of an individual maker in a very, very short period of time. So again, this is 1959. We're only 6 years past the Tureen, right? So this has happened super fast. And it's caught a lot of people by surprise. It's very divisive. As I said, some people are appalled, and then other people are following him in an almost slavish fashion. Others are inspired by him, like Mason, like Rudy Audio, like Ken Price, like Paul Soldner, and make their own independent path, drawing off of the energy that he's creating. So he's at the top of his game, to put it simply. And then something really bad happens, which is that he gets fired. So Millard Sheets, who had hired him at Otis, has this whole time been watching with growing horror as Voulkos leaves behind functional pottery which is what Millard Sheets thought he was going to be teaching, and starts doing this instead. And there are other incidents. At one point, Voulkos almost burns down the building where the kilns are located. They're also staying up really late at night. This will shock any of you who knew him personally. They're staying up late at night, they're drinking, they're smoking, they're listening to loud music. Voulkos is dragging out his guitar and playing flamenco for everybody. It's not what Millard Sheets had in mind. It's basically a bohemian subculture built around ceramics. And again, not to lay too much stress on this, but my colleague Andrew Perchuk, who I mentioned was co-curator of the show, he likes to say that Voulkos really created the first model for what it was to be an artist in Los Angeles at all. Because, Los Angeles was not an art city when Voulkos moved there in the 1950s. It was regional, it was not part of the conversation that was happening in New York City. And Voulkos was really the first person to establish a kind of beachhead for avant-garde art practice in that city, and eventually, of course, it would flower into one of the most explosive art cultures in the world. And many, many of the key people who made that happen were friends of Voulkos or were inspired directly by his example. And we're talking about everyone here from John Baldessari to Billy Al Bankston to John Mason to even an architect like Frank Gehry, who has talked about these pieces as being very influential on his formal language, which I think you can see immediately when you look at them. Okay, so he's in this situation where he's built up this magnificent presence, and then, as I say, he's fired. So he looks around to figure out what to do. Unlike in his functional pottery days when he was selling plenty of things and making a pretty good living as a potter, he hasn't been selling any of this stuff, right? So his only real collector, consistent collector, is a guy called Fred Maurer, who's teaching math at a local community college and has a rule that he never spends more than $100 on a piece. And that collection is now at Scripps, by the way, is really important. But there's no income coming from the work. So he looks around and he decides that he's going to get a job as soon as he can, and he finds one at UC Berkeley. Next slide. And so he's got these incredible objects, like this one, which is called Little Bighorn, next slide, that are being shown in lots of different places, including commercial galleries like the Landau Gallery. You see here a flyer with his own hand-drawn illustration on it. Also at the Pasadena Art Museum, where he shows in 1959. Next slide. He even has an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this is a show of 6 paintings and 6 sculptures, which is very well reviewed in the New York Times by an important critic, Doria Ashton. And this is all happening right at the time that he's having to move from Los Angeles to Northern California. Next slide. This is just one more shot of the MoMA show, and that shows you some of his paintings. I'll show you one of those in color next. There it is on the left-hand side. Just to kind of stress that painting is an important part of the picture here. And next slide, please. But when he gets to the Bay Area, he does not have the studio that he's been sharing with Mason on Glendale Boulevard. So he's immediately thrown upon his own resources. And for a while, he makes pieces in Los Angeles and then, makes pieces in San Francisco and actually trucks them down to Los Angeles and has them fired there. That lasts for about a year. But he's really kind of casting about for a new way forward. And what he eventually lands upon is bronze casting. So what has been happening in the Bay Area, particularly around the Berkeley campus community, is a very strong interest in metal sculpture, which is to some extent influenced by what they're seeing from European artists who are coming over to California and showing work. And so they have already, by the time he's gotten there, had some early experiments with bronze casting, again, mostly on the campus. And what happens is that he, together with a group of other artists, including Harold Paris, a very important colleague of his in the Bay Area, make their own bronze casting facility, which they call the Garbanzo Works. And eventually he makes his own bronze casting facility in his own studio, which is on Shattuck Avenue. And this piece, in fact, is called A Bad Day at Shattuck, which I think is one of the great titles Voulkos ever used. And so you can see that here he's using the vocabulary of his ceramics, but in other words, thrown pieces and slabs. Often what he would do, in fact, is to take big wax tablets, which is the shape that the wax came in when he would order it. It would just come in these big blocks, and he would just smash it over his knee and cast it just like that, like these kind of big, rough, stone-like objects. Next slide. And then eventually what happens is that he develops this much more sleek, attenuated, more normative, modernist style in this idiom. And here I'm showing you not one of the full-scale sculptures, but just because I thought you might be interested to see it. This is actually a maquette that he had to make to present in a public commission context. So it shows him making one of his own bronze sculptures kind of in miniature, but it also shows you the vocabulary that he's using. So spheres, cylinders, cones, blocks, pipes, very kind of machine age, and maybe a little bit more detached, in fact, from what he's doing in his ceramic practice. What's really crucial here is the way that air and light is entering his work for the first time, because he's using a totally different material, one that doesn't require working en masse as he does in wet clay. And also, it changes the kind of whole rhythm of his studio practice. So with this kind of bronze sculpture particularly, what he's able to do is make a series of components, as I say, cones, spheres, cylinders, whatever those shapes are, and then he leaves them around in his very large studio. And when he's accumulated enough of them and he's sort of in the mood, he often in the course of one night, always worked at night, he will throw them into a sculpture very quickly after he's sort of cogitated on the composition a little bit, which is obviously a very different way of working than he's been able to do in clay, where he's really had to do everything all at once without that kind of digestive process. And you'll see the impact that that has on his ceramics just in one moment. The other thing that's going on here in the mid-60s, which I think I should mention, is that he's also traveling the country and demonstrating, which I alluded to a little bit earlier. And you know, sometimes people have made the mistake of saying in the 1960s he kind of gave up on clay and was only focusing on his bronze work, and that's really not true. I think that his energies in the studio were very much devoted to bronze casting at this time, and again, he was continuing to paint as well. But when he was on the road in front of an audience, he was making ceramics, and he was very, very popular doing this. This is an image of him demonstrating at the Greenwich House Pottery in New York, for example, and we have a piece that he made in exactly this demonstration in the show. And next slide. When you look at the pieces that he was making in clay at this period, whether or not they were made in demonstrations or in the studio, they have this unbelievable quality of speed and effortlessness and really bravery, formal courage in them. And I hope you can see this, so the slide's a little bit washed out, but you can see here that it does start as a hand-thrown object, but then he's distorted it in all of these incredibly inventive ways. It reminds me a little bit, in fact, of the work of Betty Woodman, if you know her work, which was very influenced by these pieces, by these Voulkos pieces. So he's always using the wheel-thrown element as a starting place, then he's doing everything imaginable to alter it and make it asymmetrical. So he's, again, cutting into it, he's tearing it with his hands and reattaching it in different configurations, and then he's also applying different surfaces to it, like the very rich cobalt blue splash that you see on the middle of this plate. Next slide. Here's another one, which I particularly love because it's just such a clear example. This is actually not in the show, but you can see it's basically just a big bowl form. And then what he's done is take another plate, cut the corners off it, and then stick it on like a series of rabbit ears or something. So it's, again, this idea of continually reconfiguring the basic material of pottery, taking the existing DNA and reapplying it. Very much, again, like Picasso had done. Next slide. So the last thing I want to talk about from Voulkos's breakthrough years period, and which ends the exhibition, in fact, is a group that we call the Blackwares, which were made in 1968 for this show. This is the installation at the Brownstein Key Gallery, run by Ruth Brownstein, again in the Bay Area, and then the show was also reprised down in Los Angeles at Felix Landau Gallery. So these pieces were an assertive return to pottery forms. Again, he had not been doing a lot of exhibiting of his ceramics in the previous few years, and when he did, they were usually mixed in with painting and bronzes, so this is an all pottery show. And all of the pieces are black, and they were in fact fired in one go on the campus at Berkeley in the university kiln. If you go to the next slide, please. And one of the really evident things about these pieces that became clear to us as we started to study them is that they were a reaction to his own bronze work. And so I've been talking a lot about how he's using these components, these kind of modular elements, and then reconfiguring those in his bronze sculpture. And what he's doing in the blackwares is exactly the same thing, and in fact some of the forms are even the same. So the dome and cylinder that make up this very simple, powerful object, which is called a ratza, now in the Cornell University Art Museum collection, are really taken directly from his bronze work. And I imagine that he made the blackwares in a very similar way to the bronzes. In other words, he made a whole row of these different forms, and then he put them together in different configurations as felt right to him at the time. So a kind of preparatory process followed by a compositional process. That's speculation on my part, but I think it's quite likely to be the case. And is a very typical example of Voulkos's extraordinary ability to be prolific in a very short space of time. So have a lot of energy in them despite their kind of stately and settled solidity as these solid black monochromatic objects. I think I have one more picture of these. And this is a really nice example that we found of one of the blackwares that was never slipped. So it doesn't actually have the black coating on it. And it's a really great way to understand what the surfaces of these pieces are like. Because particularly in photographic form, as you can see on the right, it's really hard to appreciate them. But you can see they're like terrain. They're like the side of a mountain. And he's tearing holes in them. He's putting these welts of clay in. He's leaving the throwing rings from the wheel, very, very evident to give it this kind of rippling rhythmic quality to the surface. And all of this takes on this beautiful mineral sheen, like a kind of saturnine dull glow when he actually puts the iron slip on. Now the other thing to say about this show, and I'm sorry you couldn't see that in the one installation shot that we did have of it, is that it included mostly these vase forms, which is what he called them at the time. And then it also included plates, like this one, and next slide, covered jars, which were based on a Japanese form called the mizusashi, which is a water jar that's used for the tea ceremony that Voulkos had become aware of, again, looking at them mostly through photographs. And what's really fascinating is that the three forms that were present in the blackwares, the vase, which he would ultimately start calling a stack, the plate, and the jar form, would become really the only three forms that he used. So the blackwares, I always talk about it as like the neck of an hourglass. So he's had this extraordinary period of experimentation and sort of wild, restless, energetic exploration of all kinds of different ideas, as you've seen, and also working lots of different materials and media with each informing the other. As he would always say, the pottery informs the sculpture informs the painting, painting informs the pottery. It's all one cycle of creativity. What happens after 1968 is that he focuses down. So he basically decides that this is going to be his vocabulary from here on out, and this is it. So of course, these pieces are also wood-fired, which is something he starts doing in the late 1970s, and really has a huge impact on his work. That's probably the one big change that happens after this breakthrough era. But in terms of the basic repertoire that he's using, it has been already formulated by the late 1960s, and from there on it's simply a refinement of that template. So that's kind of the story of Voulkos's breakthrough. If you go to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit more about the legacy of this work. As I said, I got interested in the work and was very struck by the fact that there had not been a lot of, if you like, follow through on the part of museums or art historians about it. So this is just a page off of the flyer for his 1978 retrospective, which is really the most important show that had happened of his work ever, and really the only show that had done a comprehensive gathering of his early work in combination with the work from the 70s, of course, at that time. Next slide. So what we wanted to do was bring these works together, finally, and give people a chance to reassess them. So here you see the installation as we actually have it at MAD, and there are Little Bighorn and Sitting Bull, and another piece from the late 1950s in the foreground, that painting that I showed you in the back, a couple of colored pieces on the right-hand side, and I think you can see how beautifully it all fits together, and you can see how the painting and the sculptural ceramics talk to one another, and also the way that these more obviously pot-like forms talk to these more sculptural forms. So for me, the show has been a really, really satisfying demonstration of exactly how powerful an artist he was at this time. And I hope that it's going to inform the way that people think about his work. Next slide. Particularly because there's so many different strands that one can follow in thinking about his influence. So just really quickly, I want to mention two ways of thinking about that. One is in an international context. And I'm going to use this other exhibition that I'm working on right now, which is called Things of Beauty Growing, and looks at British studio pottery in the 20th and 21st century as one way into that. This show, if you're curious, is going to be opening at the Yale Center for British Art, where I'm currently working as a senior scholar, this September. And then it will also go over to the Fitzwilliam in Britain, in Cambridge, next year. So if you go to the next slide, those are the dates at the Yale Center for British Art, beautiful building by the architect Louis Kahn. Next slide. This gives me an opportunity to emphasize this really important moment when Voulkos encountered these two men, Shoji Hamada on the left and Bernard Leach on the right. Next slide. And of course, you all know Bernard Leach's work. He's kind of incredible traditionalist potter from Britain. And next slide. He and Hamada and their other colleague, Soetsu Yanagi, came to America on a very, very important teaching tour in the early 1950s, and Voulkos encountered them twice. This is just kind of a nice picture that I thought you might not have seen of Leach. This is actually a little bit earlier when he visited Alfred University in New York on his own. But next slide. Here's, of course, the famous picture of them at the Archie Bray. There's babyface Rudy Audio in the middle. And then on the left is Soetsu Yanagi, the theorist, Bernard Leach. There's Voulkos, and there's Shoji Hamada on the right. And ladies and gentlemen, just this morning, I saw the actual jar that's sitting in the middle of that picture, this Bellarmine handled jar, which was very, very exciting for me. And I had never even noticed that it's a 17th century German pot that they're all standing around, but it's sitting in Steve Lee's office at the Archie Bray Foundation. Anyway, so they have this incredible meeting. But the thing is that we all are used to thinking about this as the moment when these Japanese and British people had a huge impact on Voulkos. But what we don't necessarily think about is that it was also the beginning of Voulkos having a huge impact on them. Next slide. So immediately in the 1940s and 50s, you can already start thinking about figures who were starting to have the same avant-garde instincts that Voulkos did. Sam Hale is a great example of that. A little bit before Voulkos, actually, looking at Picasso, as you can see from this piece. Next slide. But what really has to happen is that Voulkos has to have his influence felt internationally to get to people like Alison Britton. And I'm just showing you here a very obviously Voulkos-inspired jar that she made back in the 1980s using hand building techniques rather than wheel throwing techniques. But you couldn't possibly imagine having an artist of this kind of degree of abstraction and sculptural confidence without having had Voulkos there as a precursor. Next slide. Another example of that would be Carol Manickel, just showing you a couple of her slab-built ceramics. Again, this kind of cutting into, reconfiguring attitude towards handles and decoration as a sort of painterly set of motifs rather than decorative set of motifs. Next slide. And then we can also talk about Voulkos's influence in Japan, for example. So here is another figure that you might compare to him, Kazuo Yagi, who is roughly contemporary of Voulkos and is the key member of a group called Sodeisha, whose work actually comes to California and is shown there. And then likewise, Voulkos' work eventually comes to Japan and is shown there, and there's a kind of cross current of influence both ways. Next slide. This is another Kazuo Yagi, which I particularly love, and it really shows the influence of abstract expressionist mark making, which again was something that Yagi and Voulkos had in common. Next slide. So that's the kind of international picture. And then finally, we can talk about the contemporary picture, which of course is international, but also has this highly developed state of self-consciousness about the impact of Voulkos as the titanic figure of the middle of 20th century in American ceramics. So this is Arlene Sheckett, who is maybe the most successful and influential contemporary sculptor working in clay in America at the moment. And we interviewed her for the Voulkos catalog, and she also spoke to Mary Heilman, and there's a kind of conversation between them in the catalog, Mary Heilman being another very prominent artist who actually studied with Voulkos when she was young. And we asked Arlene Sheckett what she thought about Voulkos and her relationship to him, and she said, well, I have always considered myself to be the female version of the man. So she really, really identifies with him, but she also has this very interesting kind of cagey, gendered response to his machismo, where she's setting herself up as this kind of critical, maybe putatively feminist figure in relationship to him. Next slide. And here you can see some of her work. And this piece in the foreground I thought would be particularly apt in this context because, you know, it has some of Voulkos's energetic, searching qualities, but it's also a little bit like a bodily organ, and it's a bit abject and soft and pliant. And so it does seem like a kind of response to what he was doing in some way. You know, he's doing rugged, stone-like constructivist sculpture, and she's responding to that with something that's equally abstract, equally expressive, but is maybe thinking more about issues like the breath of the body as it comes in and out, or the soft, fragile insides of the body, rather than the imposing, impassive texture of geology. Next slide. Another person who I would want to include in this context is Nicole Cherubini, another artist who works in the New York area. And again, she's somebody who identifies absolutely with Voulkos, has thought a lot about his work, does a lot of the same moves like using handles and spouts and other pieces of traditional ceramic in highly unconventional ways. And you see a couple of examples of her work here. Interestingly, she also mixes ceramic with bronze in her practice. And the piece in the foreground is ceramic on the top, unglazed white earthenware, I think, and then bronze on the bottom. Next slide, please. That's just one kind of detail of her work, showing how the immediacy that Voulkos was pioneering, as in those demonstration works in the middle of the 1960s, is something that she's taking up with these kind of finger marks and cracks and so on. I particularly love the fact that this terracotta piece, by the way, is set on a green plinth, and that's just a standard issue piece of white painted, white painted MDF plinth that's then been wrapped with store-bought plastic wrap. And that's how she gets the green color. Next slide. And then one last example, Julia Kunin, who is not that similar to Voulkos in terms of technique, because she actually does most of her work now in Hungary at a factory called Zsolnay, which is the traditional center of ceramic production in Hungary and is famous for its luster glazes. So a very different kind of surface quality from Voulkos's work. Again, almost like a counterpoint. Next slide. As you can see in this beautiful detail. But again, the overall form and the kind of energetic, expressionist approach to the asymmetrical, abstract ceramic object is again very strongly indebted to Voulkos, as I hope you could immediately tell by looking at the work. So the point here being that there is a large group of artists who are working in ceramic now, who are being accepted very enthusiastically by the art world, which is not always the case in Voulkos's day, despite the show at MoMA. And they are thinking about Voulkos really as if a painter, very much as a painter today might think about Picasso or Matisse. So he looms very, very large, he casts a long shadow, but in a funny way, it's almost like he's been gone long enough that people can start to pick up his work and use it as creative material to appropriate and then reuse to their own purposes. I think it's also really interesting that most of the leading figures in this recent ceramic movement are in fact women, as the case with the three examples I've shown you tonight. Obviously they aren't all, but certainly the gender dynamics of ceramics as they existed at Archie Bray and at Otis and then at Berkeley, partly to do with Voulkos' own persona and energies, that's completely flipped around, which I think is also interesting and important to note. Okay, so I just want to finish up with a few comments on Rudy Audio. You probably all know this wonderful picture, like the bad boys of ceramics, right? So there's Rudy on the left, Voulkos on the right, and that's Jim Leedy, of course, in the middle. And you know, assessing this group of ceramics, not only these three, but all the others that gathered themselves around them, is not really an easy thing to do. Again, to make the comparison, it would be a little bit like trying to summarize French painting between 1910 and 1945. It's that central, and it includes a lot of people who took these energies in a lot of different ways. But I think in a lot of senses, it really did start here in Montana. One thing I didn't mention, because I was saving it for now, is that there's a really interesting moment in Voulkos' career where we don't actually have any work, which is the summer of I think it's 1954. He comes to the Archie Bray Foundation, and you know, he's doing this shtick with Archie, you know, helping to build the various buildings of the brickworks, making functional pottery to sell, etc. But he also, in a way, gives himself a sabbatical and makes a whole bunch of very experimental ceramics that he then chucks out. And it's after doing that, and as I say, after going to Black Mountain in particular, that he's ready to go back to Los Angeles and be the breakthrough artist that he is. So that moment, but also the friendships that he has through Montana connections, and I think particularly the relationship to Rudy Audio, is really intrinsically vital to his development. And next slide, please. You know, I think it's really easy to see Voulkos as the leader and Audio in some ways as the follower, partly because of the chronology. Voulkos is a little bit older, partly because of their personalities, because Voulkos is this very, very thrusting, charismatic, demanding person who is a sort of center of attention wherever he is. And Rudy Audio is a much more, I think, kind, quiet, patient, supportive person. There's, I think, a tremendous tendency for people like me to say, well, Voulkos is the innovator and Audio is sort of one of the first members of the circle of those who were inspired by him. But I think it's also really important to see Voulkos and Audio as being kind of like Picasso and Matisse, as these two figures who divided up the aesthetic possibilities of mid-century ceramics between them. And just as Picasso probably would never have acknowledged that he was reacting to Matisse, I don't think Voulkos ever really would have stated clearly that Audio was somebody he was bouncing off of, but it's clearly the case. So all of the things that I've been saying about Voulkos' craggy, rock-like ceramics, I think in a lot of ways that was happening because he had somebody who was developing this lyrical, linear, painterly, coloristic, beautiful oeuvre, and that was somebody who was so close to him. And they were, you know, best friends since they were very, very young, and they were working off one another almost like melody and counterpoint in a beautiful musical composition. Next slide. So when we look at two pots like this is kind of cheating because the Audio is much later, but I feel like you can really see the distinction between the two different personalities and how they're embodied in the two works, but also you can see how they take on meaning in relationship to one another. And I think this would also be true, by the way, of Voulkos' relationship to John Mason in particular, but he's really the only other person in Voulkos' life that I think operated in that way, as somebody who was always there as like the other side of the mirror, if I could put it that way. And I think you can see it very, very beautifully, more beautifully than I can put it in words, just by looking at two pieces like this and thinking about what they have in common and what is different between them. So that's my lecture. Thank you very much for listening. And, I'm just going to have some water while you collect your thoughts. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. You have to be nice and loud when you ask. Because we're in a high school auditorium, it's going to take a while, right? Yes, in the back. Sorry, I can't see you really, but.
When Peter Voulkos made his switch from the more traditional pots to the huge sculptures, I'm sure he met resistance, and you had mentioned that before. Did he, was he very articulate in interviews or in any writing or anything about what was going on with him then and defended his work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, when he made this breakthrough or switch, was he articulate about what he was doing? In other words, did he explain it? And the answer is yes, but not much in writing. So he was a great talker, but he wasn't much of a wordsmith on paper. And we have only a couple of pieces of his writing, one of which we reproduced in the catalog. And even those, I have to say, I wonder if he really wrote them. I think it might be more that he made the text happen somehow by getting someone to kind of write down what he was saying and then maybe signed off on it. But what we do have are a lot of interviews and also great notes that Rose Slivka took when she was interviewing him. One thing that leaps to mind for me, for example, is that when the American Craft Council had its first conference at Asilomar in 1957, is that right? Yeah. Peter's nodding yes, so I must be right. So, some of you may know about that event. It was the first time that the entire American craft movement was brought together in one place out in Asilomar, California. So, furniture makers met each other for the first time. Potters met each other for the first time. It was like a big get-together. And Voulkos was there, and fortunately for us, they recorded everything that everybody said in all the panel discussions. And Voulkos was part of the panel discussion on ceramics. And you flip through page after page of the manuscript, or transcript, I should say, waiting for Voulkos to say something. And finally, it says, Peter Voulkos, : and he says, "This reminds me of why I hate organizations." And he goes on to say that he basically thinks that everybody has their heads completely in the wrong place, and that the important thing is that they're artists and they should do what they want to do, and that it's about individual expression. And any set of rules that they are setting for themselves as a group or individually is completely counterproductive. And so in saying this, of course, he's completely running against the tide of what everybody else has been saying, which is, this is so great, we're all together for the first time, let's make a council, let's make a museum, let's conquer the world together. And he's saying, like, what's your problem? Don't you have any guts? Right? So it's a very, hello? I think the battery's out, maybe.
I'm glad we made it through the presentation.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll try to be really loud. I think there's still a mic that's capturing me for the record. So the point is that he was very forceful and articulate when called upon, but he was not necessarily. I mean, he was a man of action. He was not somebody who was going to build his case primarily through language. He was going to do it through his own work. But when called upon and when he had the opportunity, he could be very to the point.
So can I just add something to that question? So then, because he had such a really rapid rise to fame and acceptance, it seems, did that make it so much easier for him? They didn't have to do a lot of defending because he just... It seems like he did really well really fast.
Yeah, so the question is, because he had a rapid rise to fame, did that make it easier for him?
For him not
to not have to defend himself?
Have to work so hard to explain himself.
Yeah, I mean, other people in the room might have a different take on this. my take, not having known him, is that nothing was going to get him to do something that he didn't feel like doing, for starters, and he was not somebody who was about defending himself. I don't actually think he did have a rapid rise to fame, really. I might have made it seem that way. Certainly he had the show at MoMA, and he was getting a lot of attention from Rose Slivka as the editor of Craft Horizons. But Slivka herself, and also other critics like John Coplans, who was an early editor at Art Forum and was out in California at the time, they felt that the art world had a lot of prejudice against his work because it was in clay. And I don't know how much Voulkos actually felt that at the time. He might have talked about that a little bit more as time went on. But certainly he never got to the point where he was selling his big sculptures easily. So they were acquired by museums eventually. But for example, when he had the show at MoMA, he sold one painting of the 6 and none of the 6 sculptures. So he wasn't finding commercial success with this work. And he wasn't finding that much institutional success outside of California. So I think it was a struggle, you know. It was not that legible to people what he was doing. And it was only once he actually started to become more of a familiar figure within the clay world and make more, actually in a way, more traditional work, you know, the Japanese style wood-fired work, that he became very widely accepted in the ceramics world, very widely collected by private individuals who thought of themselves as ceramic collectors. But that took a long time. Other questions? Yes.
When you showed that image from when it transitioned, you showed the image of the maquette of the bronze piece.
Yeah.
I think that's such a fascinating transition and such a fascinating time. And then you were explaining how he was breaking the pieces in the studio and casting that as well. When he was making those larger pieces, those outdoor installations, was he also doing that rough work with the bronze at the same time? Did that carry, because it's such a difference between the surfaces and the handling of the material, were they kind of going side by side?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's just about the bronze works and whether he was making the rough, more slab-like works at the same time as the pipe works. No, that's really a progression. And what he starts to do is cast from existing machine parts and other forms to make those harder edged pieces. And once he starts doing that, that really becomes his style. So there might be a little bit of a transitional moment there in like 63, 4, 5. But basically, once he develops that idiom, that's really what he's doing. There are a couple of public sculptures I can think of that do include the two elements together, but mostly it's going from one look to the other.
Then I have just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
When he, you know, it would have been years later when he started actually casting the big stacks.
Yeah.
So then, about when did that start? I know that's out of the purview of your lecture.
Yeah, so the question is, when did he start casting the big stacks like the one, in fact, that's in the show at the Missoula Art Museum? He started doing that, I want to say he started doing that in the 90s. I don't know the exact date. And we were just talking about this over at the museum, in fact. There was one instance where an important piece of his, called Savillanas, was damaged in the San Andreas Fault earthquake. And he basically glued the pieces of it back together and then casted it so that he could have the sculpture back, if you like. And I think that might have been a decisive moment where he started to do it more frequently. But clearly there's a strong relationship materially between the wood-fired ceramic surface and the bronze with its patination on it. And so I don't think it was a big leap for him. And so clearly he was very interested in being able to make these large outdoor sculptures with bronze. Peter, do you know more about that?
Not too much. It was later. No, we have that many pieces. There's a ton of them out there.
Yeah.
One question I had is, during the research for the show, you know, it was later in his career, but he was a pretty active printmaker.
Yeah, so it's just a question about his printmaking, and I showed the one flyer, which is, of course, a print of his. And in fact, I think the latest piece that I ever saw of Voulkos was actually a print that was a response to 9/11, because he died, I believe, in 2002, and so he did live to see that, and he made quite a dramatic print based on that event. You know, all I can say is he did printmaking the same way he did everything else, and it's one of the areas where he's most obviously expressionist. So maybe to back up a step, this is something I tend not to emphasize so much when I talk about the subject, but when a lot of people talk about his work, they think of him as the abstract expressionist ceramist. And in fact, John Copland's did a show in the 1960s called Abstract Expressionist Ceramics that had Voulkos as a kind of key figure. And certainly that was one influence on him, but it was only ever one thing in his grab bag. But when he's working graphically, and as you saw in his paintings, he's much more like a straight up second generation ABEX artist, which I think has a lot to do with the media involved and the kind of fluidity of the gestures that he can make. And obviously it has a lot to do with the fact that he's working flat and two-dimensionally. And there isn't a lot of abstract expressionist sculpture around that he can react to. I mean, I mentioned David Smith, but you'd have to work pretty hard to make David Smith into just an abstract expressionist artist, although he's clearly in dialogue. So, you know, the way I think of his prints is as one of the anchor points between him and the New York action painter avant-garde. But it does remain important to him for the whole period of his career. Yeah.
You've worked really hard to look at everything he ever made, which is probably a very unique position. Do you have a favorite?
Do I have a favorite piece of his? I think Little Bighorn and Sitting Bull are two of the most important works in American art history. So it's not so much that they're my favorites, it's more that they are essential. And to me, they represent the apex of his career. What I wrote about in the book was the Blackwares. And I think, I mean, when I'm curating, I really try hard not to think of like, what would I want to own, because that way lies madness. But certainly at the Renwick, the Blackwares have their own room. And there's just 4 of them. But standing between them, you get some sense of what it would have been like to see that Brownstein K show with all of those black stacks in one place. And I have to say, those works have never gotten any attention before this. Jim Melcher wrote one really great, super short review in Craft Horizons when they were made, and he said something great. He said, they're so haptic, in other words, so tactile, that it wouldn't surprise me if they were made in the dark. Which is a great line, and it's really true because they're so, physical. And I have to say that looking at those pieces, every time I see one, the more I see in that body of work, and the more condensed it seems, and the more powerful they seem. And I feel like that's a body of work he made very intuitively, very quickly. They were scattered quickly after he made them also because they were sold. And they feel like a very unacknowledged set of masterpieces to me. But I love them all. Other questions? Yes?
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this, but I guess I wasn't as aware of what happened when he moved to Berkeley, that he got fired and moved to Berkeley. And I'm just thinking about, I have never really thought of him as a teacher.
Oh, yeah.
You know, I always think of him as like, the artist, and that his job sort of helped him do that. And I'm just wondering if you could reflect a little bit about him as an educator.
Yeah.
Like in kind of a broader way in California or across, or was it really the work that was the biggest influence, or more like, Bob Arneson, where being the teacher was such a big influence also?
Yeah, so Voulkos as an educator. Just because you mentioned Arneson, I'll say one thing first, which is that Voulkos was unbelievably intimidating to a lot of people. And that probably included his own students to some degree. It definitely included Arneson. And he did an oral history for the Smithsonian where he says something amazing about that, where he basically says that when he first encountered Voulkos, it just made him feel like a square. Like he just thought, I can't compete with this. This guy is too much. And I think it almost defeated him. And it was like he slammed into a brick wall, and then he went around, and that's when he started doing his funny toilets and funk work. And I really feel like that was like an escape hatch from having to confront the reality of Voulkos as this figure in his way, just as an aside. But as a teacher, once you got over that, Voulkos, he was not your friend, and he was not really your teacher in any standard way, but what he did was to create an atmosphere of total liberation. That was really the key. And, I've already mentioned the all-night stuff and the, to some extent, the kind of drunken carrying on, which I think has probably been overplayed a lot, particularly in this period. I don't think he's not like some kind of raving alcoholic in the 1950s and 60s at all. There's no sense that he's made impotent by being too debauched or anything like that. He's a very potent figure, and I think he creates an empowering atmosphere for his students. But he was very liberating. And I'll just tell one story, which is from Mary Heilman, and she talks about it in the catalog. She says that the very first day that Voulkos would teach every semester with a new group of students, he would throw this big, beautiful cylinder on the wheel, and they're all sitting there like, whoa, amazing. And then he would take it off the wheel on its bat, and he would go to put it on a shelf, and he would go, whoops, and let it smash on the floor. And everybody would gasp, and then he would laugh and pick it up and start rearranging it in front of their eyes. And it was like a shtick, like Marx Brothers routine, right? That he would do every year. And she came to feel that was a kind of telling moment in his pedagogy, if you could put it that way. So the point being, don't get precious. Don't be too proud of anything you've done. Consider it all to be a process. It's all about the next move, that kind of thing. So, and a lot of that is very abstract expressionist, very mid-century, and was bound up with certainly a kind of cult of masculinity as well. But it also, I think, certainly for Mary Heilman, it was extremely freeing, and she got a lot out of that, and I think a lot of people did, including Radio Audio, by the way. Any last questions? One more? Yes.
One other thing, just a comment, but I think that the other extraordinary thing about these guys were their two things. Their sense of humor that was ever present whenever it was like a circus going on all the time, and their generosity was just extraordinary. So I think that's.
Yeah. So that was just a comment from Josh DeWeese, who said the other aspects of this whole group really was the sense of humor and the sense of generosity, which is absolutely true. And I think you can feel that in the work. There's not a lot of Voulkos work that's funny, like Arneson funny, but let's be frank, Rocking Pot it's supposed to be funny. And in fact, Voulkos supposedly called it the goddamn pot, because this is a story from Sam Jornlin, who's his great archivist and was incredibly helpful to us in putting the show together. Apparently, the Rocking Pot, before the Renwick acquired it, was used as a doorstop in Voulkos' studio. And he would always kick it by mistake on the way in to the studio. And he would go, God damn it. So he called it the goddamn pot. And I think that maybe that's a good place to end, because that is sort of like dropping the pot on purpose. It shows that even the most iconic, crucial examples of his work, in a way, were nothing to be too serious about, because it was all about the overall picture of creativity that he was creating. And so the pots that we have left are, valuable, obviously, as brilliant artworks, but they're, I think, mostly valuable, or most valuable, because of the world that they remind us of. So thank you all very much. Thanks for coming.